Happy Friday. Happy Friday. Thanks to those who are joining. Just the camera a little bit. Well, I promised that we would talk about the updated UK ICO guidance, and we will. But I assumed that by noon Washington, D.C. time, it had been out for a couple hours, and I would have had time to go through it. It looks like it was just recently posted. I received an email yesterday giving a heads up that it was going to be posted, and got up early, all excited to read this in the morning over my morning coffee, my strong espresso, and it wasn't out. So I kept refreshing. This might be weird, but I think those who are joining me because you actually are interested in geeking out on the latest developments and guidance around DID, you get it. I did have a chance to have a brief skim of it. It doesn't identify exactly what's new from this document to the last. So, and I don't remember exactly what was in the last. So we'll compare and we'll share any advances in thinking or any differences when the team gets to do that. But let me share just a couple of things, and apologies if these were actually already in the earlier report, but these were items that stood out that I do want to mention that I think might be of interest. I think they did this before, but one of the things I particularly have appreciated about the UK anonymization guidance, they frown on the identification. That's not a defined term, not a legal term. So although they recognize that re-identification, is certainly a good term of art, they guide us to stick with anonymization or pseudonymization. We are reminded that it is a spectrum. And this is a point that, we made many years ago with our de-identification spectrum, which is one of the documents cited to, recognizing that at some extreme, there is such a thing as anonymous data, and there is directly identifiable data. But then there are different waypoints in between where data can be indirectly identifiable. You might need to look something up, but it's available. It might be easy to work hard and find some data. It might be very hard too. It might be extremely hard, and it might be perhaps theoretically impossible. And that these are all contextual decisions. What else is out there in the world? That constantly changes. There's always new data sets that are made available or new processing that might be available. And so recognizing that there is this spectrum and you need to situate where your data set is. I remind people, this is, I think, also not new, but something that gets ignored sometimes, that your employees are potential attackers, and you need to take them into account. I do appreciate the conversation in the document about a motivated intruder, right? Meaning if there's money to be made or if credit to be won, or you do need to recognize that the external parties are often motivated to work hard, and whether a motivated intruder is able to identify the data is a key point. But what goes further in the document is there are intruders who are uniquely in possession of some information, but they are uniquely not motivated because they are restricted by law, by ethics. A doctor might be a potential intruder because of unique information they have, but we don't need to consider them other than in unusual circumstances where there might be some great financial motive or the like, but we generally don't need to consider them a motivated intruder. So the motivated cuts both ways, both recognizing that there are outsiders who may make money from attacking a data set, and you need to recognize that there are people with motivation, even if it's not trivial. But you also are able to recognize that there are some people who might be in a unique position because of data that they have, a financial advisor is another example of one that is named. But you do need to consider whether or not there is some particular reason that even somebody in one of these categories who you might describe as not motivated because of policy, law, how strict that is that something that's enforced? Do you lose your license? And is there some perhaps huge benefit that might question that? So again, I don't remember whether that is brand new to this document, but I think super helpful. If anybody listening has any insight on that, that'd be helpful. I also thought it useful just to touch on the pseudonymization for a second, and obviously very clear guidance. Again, not new, that pseudonymized data is personal data, but unappreciated sometimes is the great value of pseudonymizing data, particularly when you want to make some compatible additional use of it. And pseudonymization is an important factor that you can, in some degree, look to support your ability to declare that you are using a compatible purpose. There is a law in the UK, I wasn't aware of this one, that actually makes it a crime to unlawfully unpseudonymize data. And so that obviously is another helpful control that buttresses the value of this process. The secondary use also might rely on legitimate interest. For instance, even if you've collected the data based on consent, pseudonymization can support your legitimate interest basis for your additional secondary use. So again, not always fully appreciated because it can be a bit complex. I was skimming for guidance on the so-called absolute relative question, or the Breyer decision nuances that have sometimes been a differentiator between different data protection authorities. This is the question of whether or not the data that could be used to attack a data set is in the hands of a party who is not reasonably likely to be using it. Maybe it's against the law, right? And Breyer sort of reopened the door to the notion that you could recognize that there might be data somewhere in the world, but that the additional party is barred. They're not a motivated intruder, perhaps. But what exactly is that standard to determine whether or not those additional parties out there need to be considered, I think, is something that we're seeing the courts explore. EDPB just gave us some guidance, but then there's some contrary line of thinking, I think, that's emerging in some of the courts. So I was eager to look at that, and I have not managed to go through the entire, it's a big document, but the discussion comes up in whose hands is the terminology that is used. In whose hands is it reasonably likely to be identified? One very clear point that's made that is that your partners, if you are in joint controllership with somebody, you cannot rely on the notion that, well, we have a contractual agreement. If you're generating the data set and you are in contractual relationship with another party, you do not get to determine that they are an outsider who might not have, who is restricted from having that motivation. Now, I don't know why you couldn't contract that in a significant way. I think that is a place where there might be differentiation in some jurisdictions in the US, but very clear guidance. And so please do look at that and tell me if you get any insight from that and if that's new. But anybody you are in a contractual relationship cannot be ruled out as a party that is ineligible to be considered an attacker. Now, that doesn't mean an intermediary. In fact, the use case that is brought, one of the two use cases, this is one that they've developed with Trada, and it's a very common one. And again, one huge kudos that I want to give to the UK ICO is that sometimes when I read guidance from regulators, the cases that are selected are sort of these extreme ones where everybody was like, yeah, we get that. That's not at all, possible. Very, very common use cases that are in doubt sometimes are the ones that are left, without good guidance. So choosing a use case that is super representative, I think is very helpful. And I thank the team there for providing those use cases. They do provide an interesting example of an intermediary. And in all this debate nowadays around clean rooms and what's the effect of clean rooms, I think it's very useful to see an illustrated example of how an intermediary can be used to maintain anonymity. But I think the differentiation is that that is not somebody who, is in a joint controllership type relationship where they are, also having benefit from the data and arguing that they are not a potential attacker is, I think, an important point that is made. The other question, which is, I know, a challenging one for organizations often is, well, what about when you want to anonymize the data internally, right? And why would you want to do that? Well, maybe you have concerns about retention of the data. You don't have a basis to retain the data, but you do want to preserve some utility for various reasons, being able to reanalyze and assess an old data set. So you want to anonymize it, still providing perhaps some utility. And well, the guidance here is difficult. You may not retain additional data that could allow, it sounds like even if you have organizational controls, you can have a sort of separate data lake and simply say it is our policy. And again, really would love clarification if this isn't the case. There is some discussion of organizational controls, but it's more about preventing, an employee, perhaps from being an attacker. So you do need to keep the data separate, but actually retaining additional data and then just saying, well, employees cannot, use this data, but I'm routinely generating, a longitudinal data set by de-identifying data regularly when your organization has the ability to access that data set. So I think maybe that's a point of controversy. Maybe, again, that's perhaps been consistent in the UK guidance, but I think that's an area where certainly on the US side, where people are trying to explore what kind of internal controls could you credibly come up with that would allow perhaps an ongoing pseudonymization, an ongoing de-identification using the same identifier. Here, clearly, this is viewed as pseudonymized data. And again, for general analysis and other compatible uses, that may be fine and allows you a pathway to go ahead. And whether or not that eliminates your requirements in terms of having limited retention or the like when you've simply pseudonymized is a different story. So those were a couple of key things. Please do chime in if and when you get a chance to go through it. I'm going to read it over the weekend. I like to read print stuff over the weekend, so I'm not being interrupted. So my only complaint is I need a PDF, please. There's lots of links. It's super easily web accessible, and maybe that's going to be the preferred for most of you who maybe don't want to print out a long document, but I'm a little bit old school in that way. Okay, let's talk about a couple other things. 23andMe was in the news a lot. The UK recently spoke up about the data breach that 23andMe had. But what was in the news this week was the announcement that the CEO is leaving and that the company is declaring Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And much uproar about that because 23andMe holds genetic data. Lots of guidance to go delete your data. Now, look, I'm the least private person in the privacy space. I like new technologies. I want to understand, how they work. For fun, I turn on the video here and talk to people. But I recognize that, I'm the CEO. I'm a white straight male. I choose to play a public figure type role. Very, very many people, but of course there's things I want private, and very many people are in a different position, and privacy should not be set at my standard. It should be set there to protect the wide range of people who may have very good reason to be disclosing less information. But even so, even though I am out there, I've always been a little bit nervous about DNA. And although I'm super interested and we've done a lot of work around genetics and genetic data, I haven't sent in my DNA. So I understand why anybody, has good reason to go and delete the data after you've had the testing done, if you had reason to do so. The reason that some people keep it, or that the default for many has been to keep it, is that they do update, as more information is available, other people are in the data set, there's more learning. And so very often they'll update the, reports. They told you were 10%, German, and now they have more data and more information is out there. But if that's not compelling, there obviously is risk, and people are rushing to delete the data. But what's the effect of the Chapter 11? And again, there was recently a data breach. So again, shows the concern, and very well reasoned for people to go ahead and to delete their data. But should you be running because of Chapter 11, because the company is going to be for sale? Let me remind you, and I was just in touch with an old friend from my days when I worked in Congress, who was one of the staffers on the House Judiciary Committee when the bankruptcy code was being rewritten. And, around that time, there was a big issue. ToySmart company that had a lot of kids-related data. It was an online toy company with a database about kids and their toy preferences. And in the Bankruptcy Abuse and Prevention and Consumer Protection Act, thank you, David Lackman, who worked for initially Congressman Stephen Solars with me when I did, and then later on at the Judiciary Committee for Congressman Jerry Nadler. And so he flagged for me the exact language, which says, typically, company in bankruptcy, the trustee overseeing the sale, can sell the stuff to get money to pay the bills. But if indeed there was a product or service and personal information was in effect, and the policy in place was we don't sell or share your data, then you cannot sell or share the data unless the sale or lease is consistent with the policy. So in other words, if the policy said, well, we only use the data, in this way, and we will share it, then you can. But if it said we didn't share your data, then you have to appoint a consumer privacy ombudsman. And this is a real thing. A lot of people haven't heard about it. My friend Alan Chappelle has done this many, many times. Others have done this. A consumer privacy ombudsman gets appointed, and they look at the sale, even though there was a policy perhaps saying no sale, but maybe it's being sold to the same kind of company that is literally going to do the same thing with it. And so bankruptcy law recognizes that to get everyone paid and all that sort of thing, the consumers, the users, are in the same position as before. And so it is approved with appropriate, court oversight, court having delegated to the ombudsman this role. So the ToySmart database, David reminded me, was actually never sold. So again, if your data's there, what's the point? Why do you need it there? Is it, now if you're super interested in seeing the updated reports or any of the ongoing services that are supplied, and you're worried about the sale, you ought to know that the law does protect you, and they might sell the data, but it's got to go to someone who's going to be using it in the way you expected when you provided it, without creating any new or different risks. And all the law enforcement folks are on top of this, and announcing review and scrutiny, different attorneys general. So I don't think you need to freak out. Again, in general, be a little bit freaked out about your DNA data being out there, and in general, consider what the point is of anybody retaining it beyond the report that you wanted or needed. But if for some reason you have it retained and you're getting worried because of this Chapter 11 business, there's a lot of scrutiny and there is clearly law in place, and I don't think you need to worry in that regard. Okay. What else was on my mind? AppLovin. You all know AppLovin? AppLovin is one of the leading app-related ad companies, very big in gaming, or ad services to gaming apps. Gaming apps are huge advertisers. As many of you know, a lot of the games are free, so there's a huge amount of money spent on advertising in the hope of getting the minimum number of people who actually do pay because they want the sword and the shield, or the blue version of it, or all the different upsells, the whales. Now, let me be clear. In the old days, it was all these games, and then there were some, whales who spent a lot of money. The industry has gotten a lot more sophisticated, and there's a much broader number of people who are spending some money because they do want the additional items and the different premium type offerings. But in general, there's a lot of churn and a huge, number of people who aren't paying. So constant user acquisition. And AppLovin was being accused of misusing Facebook data, of fake ads that people don't know that they're clicking on. So a whole bunch of short seller reports. The stock down. Now they've announced they're hiring lawyers to go try to sue, that they're being unfairly attacked for stock trading purposes. But forget about that. What's interesting is that these are some pretty serious privacy allegations. And Cheetah Mobile, which was a leading company in this space a number of years ago, got deplatformed by the companies because of what it was doing. So follow closely. On my weekend reading, for those of you who are interested, is the new guidance around age assurance. Well, I would say guidance. What we heard, the feedback that the Canadian Federal Commissioner received in their consultation around age assurance. And this is an issue that's becoming, I think, borderline explosive, right? We have Utah having passed a law that the app stores have to handle this. We have Apple and Google with sort of proposals of how they will support apps who need the data from the information that they have. We have a whole range of third parties offering services. For a very long time, the privacy community was typically quite concerned about age assurance because of the demands to get additional data, to use face estimation, to use third-party data brokers. The civil liberties community was concerned because everyone having to, authenticate or go through a process to access content really raises a lot of speech issues. What is the harmful content? Is that content that is politically, at odds? But policymakers seem to be, moving forward, not dissuaded by those concerns, passing laws, and we still don't have good uniform, capabilities here that are respective of not dumping too much liability on different players, not creating great expense, managing the privacy issues. It's an area where we're getting much more involved. So that is going to be my weekend reading. I do want to recommend a book. let me just pull it up so I get the name right, because I have been so enjoying learning, and I'm reading it slowly. I read pretty quickly. I'll usually, power through the new, new books and kind of get the gist. But this one I'm reading really carefully because it has been such an education. These Strange New Minds: How AI Learned to Talk and What It Means, by Christopher Summerfield. And so what's interesting is I expected just sort of a bit of the drama, who are the players, OpenAI, this and that. And maybe he gets to that. But frankly, I'm deep into the book. And this AI researcher really walks through the technology. And I've read all sorts of guidance and taken all kinds of trainings and so forth. And, typically you get a certain surface level, and then it starts getting to, where if you don't have a computer science degree, you're a bit lost. Please program something using Python. Okay, I'm not learning Python right now. This walks me through. It starts, with Noam Chomsky, one of the most cited, linguists, and his theory of language, and how LLMs work in a very different way in their sort of models of understanding language. Frankly, it's made me a little more confident. I've been, doing some research and playing with some of the tools, and each time I'm like, hey, it's just predicting the next word, and that's kind of a good parlor trick. But as I started understanding a little bit more about how LLMs understand language, you can see why and how they're capable of, doing things that are compare this or find all these sorts of concepts in a statute, or, search for information in a way that's not keyword based, but sort of conceptually based. So highly recommend. It's a slow, careful read, but it's so accessible. Okay. I try to keep you only for a half an hour. Apologies, I couldn't get deeper into the DID stuff. Perhaps we'll have this conversation with some folks from the regulator or other experts, and we'll get around to that. And I'm going to read it in more detail over the weekend. Hey, if you are interested in training, we've got a couple of good courses, including around de-identification, that Rob Van Eyck, our European director, who's really deep and an expert on this, is doing. And look forward to seeing some of you pretty soon if you're coming into DC for IAPP. Happy Friday, everybody.